Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm your host, Leah Prime, and this is the Invisible Night School. Thank you so much for joining us this evening at our special time of 6 o'clock. Whether you're with us live or catching us on a replay, we're very glad you're here. The Invisible Night School is a small consortium of lay researchers and scholars exploring all manner of the numinous, ufology, paranormal, psi, all that good stuff. You can find us at theinvisiblenightschool.com. Go ahead and like, share, and subscribe to our channel here on YouTube, or join our Discord, which is linked below in the show description. Tonight, we're welcoming Bryan Senties, a guest I'm personally excited to have on the show. Bryan is a scholar and a poet based in Montreal, Canada, and teaches in the English department of Dawson College. Also in the show's description, you can find a link to Bryan's Skunkworks blog and links to his long-form interviews with Luis Caetano. So without any further delay, I'd like to welcome this evening's co-hosts, the brilliant Campbell, the inimitable Luis, our resident dubious layman, Nick, and of course, the man of the hour, Bryan. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining tonight. It's really wonderful to have all of you here.
It's excellent to be here. Yeah, thanks so much for joining us, Bryan. We've been really looking forward to this convo, and I want to just refer everyone to the past two interviews that you did on Luis's channel, because those were so excellent. I'm hoping we can touch on a few of those subjects tonight.
Yeah, sure. Actually, the question I kind of had prepared for this involves your first one. You described the UFO myth as a collective dream that expresses the anxieties and aspirations of our technological society, I believe. You came to this conclusion in the 90s. Yep. It was the period of, the X-Files, the Human Genome Project was going on, things like that. I've noticed the UFO myth kind of taking a more nebulous or mystical quality to it, referred to as the phenomenon. It incorporates cryptids and poltergeists and things like that. Do you think that change also reflects a societal change? So like in a nutshell, why did we see nuts and bolts saucers and genetic experience in the 90s, but now we see interdimensional poltergeists? Like, that's more popular.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think for the most part, it's still the case that a lot of the UFO, especially at the level of the sort of public discourse, right, in the level that it occupies us science fictionally, in the journalism and such, in the UAP reports coming out of the government, it's still very much sort of nuts and bolts. Are these drones? Are these spaceships? There's still very much a technological interpretation of them in that regard. Now, this sort of swing towards what's been called the sort of unified field theory of the paranormal that's an interesting new development, and I'm not too sure how to really segue that in to my earliest or my earlier my intuitions.
Sure.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I really hadn't given much thought to that. I mean, I've noticed this, but it is very recent. It's like surely within the past 5 years or so, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there were hints of it before with valet and stuff, the kind of the folklore aspect, or the essentially I see as like the Descartes' demon version of ufology.
Well, actually, if you go right back to the beginning of the phenomenon in the late 40s and even before, right, because there were stories of Venusians visiting us in the 1930s,
right,
in the sort of New Age culture of the West Coast, and there. Even in the earliest interpretations coming out of Adamski and company, coming out of that sort of nascent New Age culture, the flying saucers were looked at as etheric, right, as belonging to different higher vibrations, as not being nuts and bolts, and so on. So there you've already got the sort of nascent intuition or the nascent interpretation of them as sort of something spiritual, for lack of a better word, as opposed to machines. But that is, that's a funny thing. I tend not to touch on that too much because that wasn't as compelling to me in a way, nor is it as compelling to me now.
Right.
But that's just my own perversity more than anything. Yeah. So what's your take on that? You mentioned Descartes' demon.
Well, just kind of the entity or the intelligence that's outside of our reality kind of messing with us. I mean, that's kind of like
Oh,
a
I see.
simplified
Mhm.
version of.
Yeah, that is interesting because you see, I mean, you read some people sort of trying to weave in the Gaia hypothesis,
Mhm.
trying to weave in, of course, the simulation hypothesis now that UFOs are maybe not just glitches, but they're also sort of intrusions by, the gamekeeper, as it were, or
Right.
the dungeon master, or
Mhm.
whatever's in charge. Um, yeah, that again, I'm not. That doesn't really do it for me.
Right.
Mainly in part because I'm very skeptical of the simulation hypothesis for a number of reasons.
Mhm.
Um, but maybe, hey, there's a whole new territory to be probed there. I don't know what I'll find, but that's a door to open.
Yeah.
Thanks for raising that question.
Bryan, I'm really happy to have you here, and you're a, professional academic, and I realize that we haven't sort of allowed the community to be aware of your exact qualifications. So I was wondering if you could just give us a quick rundown of your expertise, and then maybe I'll ask you a follow-up question after that.
Sure. Qualifications. Is anybody qualified in this field? Um,
Some more than others.
some more than others. Well, yeah, you can make the case, eh?
Yeah.
My undergraduate studies were in philosophy. I've got a 4-year honors degree in philosophy. I focused on Wittgenstein's private language argument, but with much more interest in continental philosophy, particularly existentialism at the time. Then, because I was a poet before I went to study philosophy, I wanted to sort of give more time to my poetry, my writing. So I came to Montreal, where I did a BA in English. The creative writing option at Concordia University is very interesting because you do as much academic work as you do creative work, and the thesis in my case was a pseudo anthology of a bunch of works which tried to work on the synthesis between poetry and philosophy, which is a concern that goes back to the German Romantics 200 years ago. Also, because I was coming from philosophy to English, I had to do an extra year of undergraduate courses in English literature. After that time, I was bounced around, teaching this, teaching that. But then in the mid 90s, because I have a friend who's Dr. Susan Palmer, who's a very important scholar of religion, we got together to do a paper on the Raelians, where we helped, where we sort of articulated hypothesis about how the UFO myth works in relation to technological society, which we presented at the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion conference in 2000, I think it was. That got picked up by Nuevo Religio, which is an academic journal. And since then, it's been included in a number of textbooks. And it's also a revised version is in the Cambridge Guide to New Religious Movements. So yeah. Those are my qualifications, if any. And then I've been working on this Skunkworks blog for a few years, and I've been working on this sort of long form epic poem on and off since the mid 90s.
Wow.
It's fascinating. And so you have a lot of knowledge in English literature, and analysis, history, things like that, philosophy, especially logical reasoning, applied philosophy, even, I imagine. And so I remember from your previous conversations with Luis, you mentioned at one point that you aren't super convinced by Dr. Jacques Vallée's argument that, and this sort of is similar to what Nick was saying in some ways, that the history of these reports in the literature, in the history of English writing and things like that, they're very similar in some ways. But I remember you saying that you're skeptical of that in other ways, like because a historical description of like an elf was like a luminous being, and then it's like you look at that. So then you can sort of look at that looks kind of similar. So would you be able to sort of detail why you're skeptical of Dr. Vallée's look back over the history and claiming that it's all one and the same?
Yeah, not just Vallée. He's not the only one he's the most famous proponent of this. And of course, that was his thesis articulated in Passport to Magonia, most famously, and then in some works subsequent. I, unlike some, take history and time very seriously. Any student of Martin Heidegger will have to put time and temporality in the foreground in the nature of the human being and human experience and human understanding. Because of that, any particular story has got to be understood in its historical context. And that is, of course, an endless task. It's one that we can never exhaust. And for that reason, when we try to sort of project sort of descriptions that we have today onto things that strike us as similar, well, that is, I think, a projection, to put it very, very simply. Moreover, and I'm not the first to make this point, I think Martin Cottenmeier is probably the first, comes to mind anyway, when you actually look very carefully at the description of the fairies, the Shay, the fairy abductions, and so on, you can find interesting parallels, but there's a lot of very remarkable sticking points as well, where it just doesn't jive. What is interesting, I mean, from a poetic point of view, from a mythological point of view, these sort of narrative parallels are very compelling and very useful when it comes to thinking in that way. But I'm the first one to sort of, hold up a hand and say, the ways of understanding are very, very different in the Middle Ages than they are today. They're very different in the 17th century than they are today. So, for example, at the Archives of the Anomalous Conference, Jacques Vallée and others brought up the example of St. Francis of Assisi. And St. Francis of Assisi from the 13th century is often held up as an example of what today we would call a close encounter, where there's a luminous light, where there's injuries suffered. The stigmata of St. Francis of Assisi, there are voices that are heard, there's paralysis, and so on. However, if you actually look at the stories that Vallée was pointing to, you find that you can't take the report at first hand, right? This is the first sticking point, is that you can't read accounts from the Middle Ages in the same way you read a sighting report from 1997.
Right.
A good point of here is that, during the encounter, St. Francis raises his hand 3 times. All right. Now, that's not to be taken literally, right? St. Francis is raising his hand 3 times because the number 3 is significant in Catholic theology and Catholic symbology and Catholic iconography, right? The light that he sees with an eye in it, this is not a witness report. Or if you take it that way, you've got a lot of philological labor to do to justify that that's in fact how you're going to take it and how we should take it. There's a lot of symbology, a lot of symbolic language. You've got to ask, why are they saying what they're saying? What's the rhetoric? What's the sort of code in which they speak?
Yes.
Right? So at the same time, for example, to draw a very famous example, I'm sorry, the Israelites did not wander in the wilderness for 40 years, right? After the slavery in Egypt, after the escape with Moses, right? They wandered for 40 years because 40 is a significant number in Judaism for times of change, right? And that's why the Lord spends 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness after his baptism with John the Baptist. He didn't really spend 40 days, 40 nights. He spent a symbolically significant amount of time, right? Signifying the change. So unless you're aware of the codes, the narrative codes, right, that go into how these stories are told to convey the information that they want to convey, you're just going to misunderstand them.
Sure.
That being said, okay, it's not so simple. Because Joshua Cutchin, okay, would be one of the first to come back at me and say, well, no, wait a second here. And he could bring together, bring a whole bunch of stories forward that are much more sort of innocent in their reportage, which are much more suggestive of the thesis that, okay, maybe we are dealing with a similar kind of phenomenon that just dresses itself up in different ways, right? Again, I can't come down hard and fast, but what I do want to say is if we're going to look at pre-modern stories or non-Western stories, we have to do the philological labor, right, that allows us to understand the narrative codes that are being used to articulate that story, and only then can we begin to guess that, oh, maybe it's the same kind of thing. That'd be my position. Does that answer your query?
Yes, that's that's excellent. Thank you. Exactly. Like, just one follow-up I would have is that, like, an argument that I come up across a lot online is that, and it's when I'm arguing with people on Reddit or something, and I say something to that effect, and they'll say back, like, oh, well, human history, the way that we've recorded human history and we understand human history is the same thing, but you believe history, right? So, like, that you think that this event happened in history, but the narrative is essentially the same quality as the one that you're discounting here. And, you know, of course, the argument can be made that you're, like, talking about something that's fantastical instead of something that we know about. But like, what sort of is that sort of your approach to that argument, or how would you respond to that? Just because I've seen it so many times.
I'm not too sure of the retort exactly.
Yeah.
So what does the person answer you exactly again? I'm not too sure of what they're getting at.
The essence of the criticism that I've seen frequently is that, like, our history books are written out of accounts that are of the same essentially quality as many of these historic UFO reports, in quotes, and therefore what is the rationale for discounting one set that you know, in quotes, agree with, and the other that you have an opposition to, would be the argument. Or it's the argument I've seen sometimes. But yeah, I mean,
okay, I don't know if I'm answering this.
Yeah.
But look, in English we distinguish between history and story. You don't in French, because French histoire and histoire, there's history and there's story. In German it's Geschichte and Geschichte, story and history, and that's important because one thing we've really come to understand quite acutely since the 1980s, since the days of quote unquote high theory, big H, big T, high theory, is that history is a literary genre. And as such, it obeys certain narrative conventions. Actually, quite surprisingly, or not surprisingly, those that are shared with fictional narratives. And so we come back around again. History is not history, right? I mean, historiography is itself a genre which presents itself in different ways, in different times, in different places. That's the first great change, great challenge. The second challenge is how to understand narratives that are written out of a different narrative set of conventions. You've always got to ask that question. And the thing is that a lot of people like Erich von Däniken and what's his name? The fellow with the Netflix series right now.
Graham Hancock.
Graham Hancock. Yeah. They take everything at face value. Everything at face value as if it's always the same. Now, for a journalist, I understand that. A journalist hears everything as a journalistic story, right? But sorry, Graham, no. So he asks the question, for example, well, why are all these stories of culture heroes? I don't know. Maybe because wherever you have a culture, you have a myth about where the culture comes from. Go figure. Why are they the same? Well, because, you had people kind of like coming up with agriculture, and then agriculture leads to settled society, which leads to class division, which leads to architecture, and so on and so forth. Why do they all have, interest in astronomy? I don't know. Maybe because if you're an agricultural society, you want a pretty accurate calendar to make sure that you don't starve to death. Maybe that's a good idea. Maybe there is an explanation. So these are the sorts of things we have to take into account over and over and over again. This is not to discount at the same time these very compelling analogs and parallels, but you don't want to fall into the Erich von Däniken syndrome, right? Where everything, I've got some great books on the bookshelf here where they show minarets. Oh, it looks just like a rocket. They must have seen rockets. Well, I don't know. Maybe we can come up with a slightly more fine-grained approach to what's going on there.
There's a common object. Yeah.
The tower. Oh, the tower looks like a rocket. Well, yeah, sure. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar too.
Excellent. Yeah. You really answered my question. Thank you for that.
Okay, I'm glad. Yeah, not that that's going to persuade anyone who's persuaded.
Of course not.
It'll persuade enough, like 5% or whatever.
This is the other thing, right? As someone who's read far too much philosophy with probably far insufficient understanding, who can blame me? the common sense view of the world is that there is a cosmos of self-identical objects out there which exist apart from our perceptions and understandings of them. Okay? And it's the same throughout time and space. Right? So that the relation of me to some historical event is the same as the relation of me to the tree outside my window. Right? In other words, there's something stable out there. But this is, of course, to completely discount the consciousness, the temporal consciousness, and all the hermeneutic dimensions, right? All those aspects of understanding, right, that go into making sense of the world, which is something which is made sense of. And we can't forget that. And that's always forgotten. There's a too simple-minded ontology about the world, which there's a kind of a naive realism, for lack of a better word, and a discounting of the activities of the human mind, especially the human mind as a cultured phenomenon. Something which is, as Richard Rorty says, culture goes all the way down. I'm not perfectly persuaded of that, but it's a good catchphrase. Culture goes all the way down, and culture includes language, right? And once you take that into account, then the difference between different cultures, different times becomes much more obvious, and you can begin to at least take that refraction into account. And if you don't take that into account, well, you're not doing justice to what you're presumably studying. That'd be my position, I think.
Wow. That's wonderful. So as soon as you said Raelians, Bryan, in the back channel chat, I was like, oh, I'm going to ask the next question. So I skimmed your paper with Susan Palmer today, actually. And when I think back to the 90s, right, we have Raelians and Heaven's Gate. And now we see in what I perceive to be something of an emerging folk saint in like the Chris Bledsoe story, for instance. What are your views on ufology as an emergent religion? And then also how it's changed from the 90s more millennial kind of flavor versus how we're seeing it now in our current moment?
Oh yeah, no, that's a very rich vein to mine. Holy smokes. First of all, the UFO has always been a religious object, right? As I remarked, even before flying saucers as such appeared, there were people in the New Age community, in the IM community, who were encountering Venusians in caves in California. The moment that the flying saucers came on the scene, well, who was there but George Adamski and other the contactees who brought in a religious dimension to it. Now I've lost my thread. So let's go back a little bit. So it's always been religious. UFOs as an emergent religion. That's a very good question. I know that Diana Heath, as she calls herself now, is a great proponent of this view, and it's one I understand and one I kind of share. See, that what's interesting about the UFO as religion is that it works against more traditional religions, especially as we understand them in the Abrahamic religions. But I'm not so as persuaded of this point as I was when I wrote the paper with Susan back in the 90s. Because as you remember, in that paper, I said, listen, before modernity or post-modernity, and for me, they're the same thing, there was a cosmos where there was an inside and an outside. There was a nature and a supernature. And unless you're a Spinozist, God is not identical with nature. God is outside space and time. Right, and with his angels, and likewise, I guess the devil is outside of space and time, with his demons and devils and so on. And then these creatures intrude into space and time, into nature, and you have to have that idea to make sense of things like the miraculous, right? Because the miracle is precisely that which is supernatural.
Right.
However, with modernity, this gets collapsed, and so that today we don't talk about any place outside of space and time. We talk about the multiverse. Right? Which is still within nature. It's just that there's kind of different sections of nature, different cells of nature, if you will. Right. They're no longer an inside and an outside. So any kind of religion that might emerge from the UFO as such would be a very strange, would be a very modern religion in that regard. Because the thing is that wherever the beings supposedly come from, whether a different planet, a distant star, the interior of the earth, a different dimension, they're still coming from within nature. There's no more supernature. Moreover, they're very much, they're human, all too human. However much, quote unquote, man is made in the image of God, right, as in the Abrahamic religions, aliens are not, they're not gods per se, right? They're just more advanced species, right? So even someone, you know, in the sort of the channeling community, if you keep track of what, of the sort of myth that people like Michael Salla is spinning, right, which is very sort of new age again, right? You're just dealing with human beings that are just smarter or been around longer, and they're more crafty. They've got, like, you know, better Teslas. That's different again, right? That being said, it is the case that the UFO possesses a numinous religious dimension. It creates awe in a way that a natural phenomenon does not. It's sort of it's what they use. The Jack Hunter uses the expression ontological flooding, right? Sure. So kind of blows your mind in the best tradition of any sort of religious like experience. But you know, the other thing is that religion not only kind of gives us a cosmic orientation, you know, what is human beings, where do we come from, what are we here for, but it gives us a moral orientation, right? One thing that the religion does, I can't imagine, I don't know a religion offhand that doesn't have a moral code attached to it. But I don't see a moral code that comes with the UFO per se. You have a kind of, you have this sort of like this kind of space operatic, Gnostic vision of good ETs and bad ETs and things like this. And you've got a sort of evolutionary idea of ascension, right? That they're guiding us towards something greater. So you've got that sort of irrational or transrational dimension, which religion serves, right? And that perhaps that's what it answers. One thing that modernity does not give us is a direction. Science doesn't tell us what's good or evil. It can only describe nature, and it's this disorientation that comes with, you know, the loss of traditional religion, the quote unquote death of God, right? Thanks to modernity, that leaves people sort of floating around, and into that vacuum, right, arrives the flying saucer, either as something etheric, quote unquote supernatural, or super technological. So there it's now is this going to result in, you know, a new Christianity, or something to replace Christianity, something to replace whatever, you know, you see as the reigning religious paradigm? Which brings to mind the fact that for the first time in England, there are fewer Christians than anyone else. Less than 50% of the population is Christian. That just came out in the Guardian today. Yeah. Will there be like a religion that will take the place? I don't think so. It doesn't seem to offer that. But then, of course, see the other interesting analogy is between nascent Christianity, you know, back in the Roman Empire, and the UFO religion is that both seem absurd. Right? The educated Romans at the time looked at Christianity and they just laughed. They said, "This is just nonsense. This is silly. These people, look, they're kind of stinky. They don't speak right. They haven't read anything, and their ideas are just illogical. I mean, what's going on with these people? Why is anyone taking this seriously? Why is my wife going to this church? I don't get it." And surely it's the case, right, that all the discourse around UFOs suffers the same fate from the powers that be, the institutional powers of science and what have you. There's still a great chuckle factor. And I'm not the first one to bring that point up. I mean, Vallée brings that up himself. What has happened, I think, and this goes back to the original question, is that where there was a very sort of strong nuts and bolts component, it has really been taken up, both maybe because of the way that the popular science discourse has developed over time, with the simulation hypothesis, with quantum computing on the on the horizon, perhaps, with just the notions of quantum physics becoming more popularized, concerns about consciousness that segue or dovetail or combine with interests in psychedelics and so on. It all seems to be sort of like mixing together with that and taking up some of that residue. And hence we get the sort of weird interpretations that you get from people like Greer, for example, where people are meditating and talking to the aliens through ESP and so on. So I don't really see it as a religion in the making, but I could be very wrong about that. What is the case is that it has and continues to inspire religious sentiments. It has and continues to inspire actual, I'll put the word in quotation marks, cultic behavior, not only in the religious form. I mean, this is actually the initial inspiration for the paper, was that, how the UFO inspires quote unquote cultic behavior, whether secular or religious. Just go to a MUFON conference, go to the UFO conference and see all the people in front of Taylor Travis or Travis Taylor.
We understand this,
behavior, right?
I'd love to pull a thread that you made reference to briefly. You were talking about the history with polytheism and then monotheism, and how UFOs maybe don't fit so well into the modern Christian religious sort of worldview, but perhaps the older version with the pluralistic deities was more effective for the story. And it was making me think that we've got this thing in modern ufology where we have a ton of different species of aliens and things, and then we're seeing a consensus emerge where it's all this one thing that is supernatural again. And so we're moving from the physical to the supernatural central thing. And in the history of religion, you were making me realize the history of religion has moved from pluralistic pantheons to monotheist faiths. And that's a rather interesting parallel that you sort of made me think about. And I'm wondering if you see any kind of reason, a common reason for that between those two systems.
Well, I like the pattern that you found, this sort of going back and forth. To me, it's still the case that a lot of the UFO discourse is best understood as kind of a Gnostic mythology, right? Where there's a lot of paranoia involved. There's a great deal of plurality involved. There's a great deal of that's important about the experiencer, right? Gnosis differs from episteme, in as much as gnosis is knowledge by acquaintance, right? So the mystical experience is Gnostic, in as much as the experiencer has direct acquaintance, direct intuition of the divine, as opposed to the theologian like Thomas Aquinas, until he had his mystical experience, where it's just a lot of thinking, a lot of reading, and a lot of knowledge about God and angels and so on. So the thing is, like, Gnosticism was pluralistic in as much as it depended upon the experiencer, right? And there's a lot, and the thing is, there's even in ufology, right? There's a great emphasis on the fact that some people seem prone to the experience and others not. Okay, and for this reason, it's been called Gnostic. So the thing is that it doesn't fit our ordinary frames of epistemology. So, like physics, anybody can conduct a wave tank experiment and presumably get the same results. In ufology and other fields related to it, only some people can see the fairy. They have to have second sight. Only some people can actually see the flying saucers. Only some people will have experience with the entities that fly them. Okay, and that maybe got to do with their brain formation. Might have something to do with something else. We don't know. Moreover, there's lots of different gods, lots of different species, lots of different creatures. And some of them are malign and some of them are benign, and you don't know which is which. And if you read a lot of Gnosticism, boy, it sure sounds familiar. Now, this drive towards a unified field again, right, that we mentioned earlier, that would seem follow from a number of different impulses, wouldn't it? On the one hand, in the Anglosphere, now you see, this is the other thing, right? A lot of our UFO discourse comes to us out of the United States, which is a profoundly Christian country in its own weird way, right?
Yes.
Yes. And from that will come a certain drive towards the monotheistic, right? Or dualistic, a Manichaeism, right? Between good and evil, between God and Satan.
And the eschatological, too.
And the oh boy.
Yeah.
Well, sure, disclosure. I mean, and Lewis has made this point, and among others, right, that this drive towards disclosure bears a lot of resemblance to the eschatological drive in fundamentalist Christianity, right? That Christ is going to come back. Revelation, after all, means quote unquote disclosure. I mean, take the apocalypse, take the lid off the pot. That's what it means to reveal. That's what it means. So now, but to get back to the sort of monotheistic religions, keep in mind that Christianity, for all of its overt monotheism, is very polytheistic. I was raised a Catholic. Okay, and you've got God the Father. Oh wait, there's God the Son, and there's the Holy Spirit. And oh wait, there's the Virgin Mary. And oh wait, there's all the angels. And so it's a kind of a covert polytheism. All right. Judaism begins actually with a male and female God, going back. And the monotheistic drive actually occurs when Judaism had to defend itself and distinguish itself from the polytheistic peoples among which they lived, among whom they had been enslaved. Right. So Isaiah comes out with there's only one God and it's our God, very forcefully to help create a kind of cultural coherence for the Jews in exile. In Islam, I'm not really authorized to say. I don't know Islam that well, but I bet if you scratch the surface, you're going to find certain polytheistic dimensions going on.
Well, what you just said is
much more militant, isn't it? It's
what you just said is very interesting to me. What you just said. You pointed out that in Judaism historically, the drive towards monotheism was motivated by prosecution and the desire for a shared culture. Now that's kind of interesting because if we look at the modern UFO community, when they were fragmented, seeing it all as mechanistic and different entities, there was a lot of critiques and ridicule. And so what we maybe have done societally is have we pushed them into a radicalized monotheistic culture in a similar way that religions have tended towards that?
Yeah, who's the Isaiah of the UFO people?
I would want to say
Benias would call them. That's a good question. It's also the case that, speak more philosophically, that there is a drive to unity in the human understanding. However much you might want to be a cultural relativist, there does come a time when push comes to shove, and you've got to say, what is true. Because we can't. I don't know. Maybe I should just speak for myself. But reason has a hard time dealing with persistent contradictions, right? Because ultimately the world is one thing, and in fact, you couldn't have a contradiction unless the world were one thing within which those two contradictory elements were brought together, right? So the fundamental drive to unity in reason, to use a Kantian term, or the understanding, to use a hermeneutic term, that seems nascent to, or sort of characteristic of at least Western culture, if not human reason as such. That's a big thing to say, and I'd have to think about that a lot more before I set it up as something to defend. So does that answer your question? Hopefully not. Hopefully not.
Enough of it to be interesting. I'm going to keep thinking about it though, because you're really bringing some things to my mind. But I'm happy to pass this.
What are some of the semiotic similarities between, like you talked about the airship stories from the late 19th century and the current brouhaha about the Nimitz encounters and the Navy, other Navy encounters of UAP?
Well, that's my go-to answer. That's a good question. I mean, the thing is, what is delightful about the whole airship stories from 96, 97 primarily, semiotically, if you will, is that it repeats the modern version over again. I'd be hesitant to sort of connect it up with the Nimitz stories and so on. But if you look at the airships, first of all, they mimic the aeronautical science of the day. We were just on the verge of creating such things, although they didn't look the same way, they didn't sound the same way, they didn't fly the same way. Just like you have the Roswell crash and other, much more frequent crashes, you had crashes in Aurora, Texas, for example. There's a story of a cattle mutilation of Von La Lettre, which was a hoax. We know this is a hoax, but it's funny how it comes up. And actually what happens is the cow that they find later is mutilated exactly as cows will come to be mutilated in the modern era.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Moreover, you had a great variety of occupants of the airships. Sometimes they were tall and blonde and naked. Don't ask me how or why. Sometimes they were diminutive and from Mars. Okay. Sometimes they were human inventors. Sometimes they appeared to be foreigners. All right. And sometimes in the 50s, it was funny how you would have UFOnauts described as if they were Italian, kind of short and dark haired and swarthy. So you had that as well. So kind of all the motifs that you find in the modern era, you have already in the airship era in 96, 97. And what's interesting about that is I think a strong case can be made that there were in fact no real airship sightings. That this was purely an invention of the yellow journalism of the day. And if I'll have to get one of my unpaid interns to get to work on that, maybe set up a team. And there's a nice little research project there, or a book. I think a wonderful book in either media studies or folklore or something. Maybe someone's already done it. I don't have that book on my bookshelf, but I think that'd be a very interesting thesis to probe and sort of test. Is it all just the yellow journalism of the day? And if so, what does that tell us about today? And how did it happen? How did it work? For whom was it just to sell papers, or was it had something to do with the Spanish-American War coming up? Good question, etc. So I wouldn't say that's what semiotic as sort of narratological. Anyway, yeah.
You began touching on this, and I'd love to dig in a little bit further around ufology as speaking to popular anxiety about technology and surveillance. Almost thinking of it as like an egregore, right? This sort of like collective outgrowth of the popular consciousness, particularly with regards to what's effectively global and existential risk around climate catastrophe, war. And I also think about the reports of UFOs appearing, say, at nuclear missile silos. So I'm trying to tie this all together into this notion of ufology providing a redemptive arc to humanity. And I was wondering if you could just dig a little bit more into that, particularly around our current sort of technological, I would say, anxiety and crises in 2022.
Yeah. It's funny. There are a number of possible ways to answer that. I think that the first way that comes to mind is the UFO as a kind of free energy technology. This is a big theme in Stephen Greer, for example, and not him alone. That the UFO represents a kind of technology, a free energy technology, a zero-point technology, which is a technology without emissions, all right, which is an infinite technology. So in the same way, in the more sort of orthodox, mundane world where we're trying to develop nuclear fusion, the UFO is seen as a possible solution to the climate change crisis because it gives us a free emission, an infinite emission-free source of energy. That's first So as a technological salvation, right? So again, what's going to save us from the mess that technology has gotten us into? Technology. All right.
Yes,
The
more
same kind of thinking
technology.
that more technology. That's the same sort of thing that goes into geoengineering, right? We've inadvertently geoengineered the Earth into the situation we're in. So we're going to have to like now choose to do it our own way, and hopefully with greater success. So in that regard, second of all, there's a sort of social and political dimension where it's imagined that by people like Bryce Zeibel and Richard Dolan and others, kind of following up from the very famous quip that Ronald Reagan supposedly gave to Gorbachev, that, oh, if we faced an invader from outer space, then the nations of the earth would unify. So among the disclosure crowd, there's a lot of speculation about, well, okay, once it comes out and it's revealed to us that, okay, we're being visited by extraterrestrials or extra dimensionals or whatever you have, what effect will that have? And one answer that is proposed is that humankind will recognize itself as one species, and the differences that divide us will pale in comparison to the difference that we share or that we have, that we bear towards these aliens. And this will result in global peace. All right? So there's your answer to war and competition. Moreover, of course, going back to the technological dimension, any advanced and then you find this in SETI as well, right? The idea here, one of the reasons we want to contact another civilization, not of this earth, is that, well, if they're advanced enough to talk to us, then they must have been through the same problems that we have, overpopulation, pollution, perhaps global warming, and so on, and maybe they could share their solution to that problem. Okay, so even among sort of more sober researchers, such as the SETI crowd, there's that drive that, okay, other people have been through what we're going through, and therefore they can give us their answers. Yeah, that I'm sure there are other ways to respond to that, but those would be the top three off the top of my head, anyway.
Wonderful.
What do you
Thank
think?
I mean,
Your thoughts?
Yeah. I'm very fascinated.
Like, keep in mind, I don't buy any of that, right?
I mean, it really speaks to us.
Probably, see, for me, this is what's important, right? But anyway, sorry, someone's saying something here. Please
go ahead, Nick.
Oh, I said that speaks more to the fact that we're looking for ourselves. I think SETI's goal, we're kind of looking for ourselves too, and same with the contactees. It's always us. They're the colonizers. They're the answer to these problems, and they must have experienced what we did. I can't understand it, so I must assume that it's like me. It's interesting.
Do you think that ufology? I've always thought of ufology as more of a subculture than a field. And do you think that
yes,
if that's true, do you see it like a giant role-playing game where people can just participate?
That's funny.
Or do you think, what ways do you think that it is a role-playing game, and in what way do you think it's not?
Well, what in life is not a role-playing game? I mean, look, this is the real answer. This is the whole idea of the subject position. This is the whole idea of interpolation in ideology critique. Is that we're provided with these slots into which we put ourselves, right? Male, female, student, worker, mother, father, brother, friend, whatever. Right? There are these general slots into which we all place ourselves, and then roles that we play. We make that. That being said, I've got to say that there is a drive to make ufology a much more to found it as a serious discipline. So you have UAPX, for example. You have the Society for Scientific Exploration and their work. You've got the group around the new journal Limina, which is working towards this sort of foundational work. And I just found out today about another group in Canada here. The name eludes me. They're primarily Francophone. And I'm sure there are other groups around the world that are trying to establish ufology or UAP studies as a science. In the University of Würzburg in Germany, they've actually established a program in, I think, the physics department, but I could be wrong, for UAP studies. Right. So, and I tell you, when a German university establishes a program like this, you've got to sit up and take notice, because they're a pretty serious bunch, and they're not going to let in the woo, as it were.
Well, that's an interesting point, Bryan, because I've taken a very serious look at the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies and UAP.
Thanks for bringing that up. Yes.
And there are these individuals involved who are major players. For example, Dr. Kevin Newth out of University of Albany, I think, or Arizona. Anyway, it's one of those, and they're very different. But he is heavily involved in these things. But, he wrote a published peer-reviewed physics paper, in quotes, calculating the speed of the Nimitz event. And then when I'm getting into it, I find, that's actually a journal that he founded and he's the editor of, And so then you look in the paper and he's calling it a craft over and over. I'm looking at interviews with him, and afterwards he's, talking with Vallée, talking with people about how it can't be natural. It is impossible. It literally said it cannot be. And Vallée is sitting there next to him being like, well, it could be a plasma, but if it is, we don't know how it operates. So these people who are involved at the forefront of the modern taking it seriously and making it scientific, in my experience, I'm seeing them exclusively use the word craft to describe the objects, which is, applying an interpretation to an observation.
Yes.
Then there's a variety of other things I could cite. Like I sat down with Larry, he's a board member of SCU, Larry Hancock, I believe his name is. He told me straight up to my face, these are not natural. When I was citing to him, whatever. Anyway, so what are your thoughts on that? People who are so prominent, and they're sort of saying that they're being objective and stuff, but then when you actually talk to them, they're saying these cannot be natural. And that makes me just think that people tune out. What do you think?
Okay, first of all, a lot of the quote unquote prominent people, okay, this is the thing. These are the prominent people, and they're prominent for various reasons. First of all, if you look back historically, right, there are sort of very much more serious, sober people. James McDonald, one. Sturrock, physicist at Stanford. There's another fellow who wrote a book called Project Identification.
Professor Harley Rutledge.
Harley Rutledge, I thank you. There's the people investigating the Hessdalen lights. You had
Professor
Teodorani.
Dr. Trainer, Assistant Professor Erling Strand.
Dr. T. he was on a little while ago. You've got this fellow who set up the program at the University of Würzburg, right? So you've got these sorts of people. Kevin Knut, I don't really want to. I can't really. I haven't looked at his paper very carefully, and I'm not really qualified to say much about that. And I want to say something about that in a second. But there are the people that look there. You can talk about Gary Nolan, for example. Who on the one hand is doing spectrographic analyses of residues and traces, while at the same time saying a lot of other really kind of far out things, shall we say. Okay. But these are the people that get the limelight. There are a lot of other people who, again, still reside in quote unquote the invisible college, precisely for this reason. And they're sort of keeping their heads down. They're doing their research quietly, sometimes on the sly, maybe sometimes, now they're able to do it more out in the open. Proceeding very carefully. Among these are people trying to ground UFOs or ufology or UAP studies as a science. This is what the group around Limina is working on. So they're very, very, conservative in this regard. One reason, what I want to say about all that is that I work very hard to keep a rather clear line between looking at the ufological as the collection of all the stories about UFOs and all the various media, the mythology we might call that, right? And then whatever it is that gives rise to those stories. All right. And the question of the being of that, the ontology of that, the nature of that is something I'm not really qualified to talk about. And it's a real rabbit hole. I'm only one man. I make jokes about unpaid interns. I need more. And then I could get some unpaid interns who've studied physics, who've studied this and that, and they could look into that for me. Right. But as you know, if you get talking to someone who's okay, a good example is a couple people I know. What is it? There's one fellow who spoke with. Oh dear. Hello, brain. I'm sorry. Your linguistic cortex has gone offline. Please try again later. Hussan Ali Agrama, who is a scholar of religious studies, I believe, at the University of Chicago, I think. He presented a paper at a conference proposing that we take UAP, quote unquote, seriously as in their ontological sense, right? As some sort of phenomenon whose nature we do not know, but it is not readily explicable. The psychosocial hypothesis does not do justice to it, and therefore it presents certain interesting questions and problems to our orthodox ways of understanding things. But he's the first to admit that he's a UFO newbie. He hadn't really gotten into the field until 2015. And I can attest in my own experience that, the moment you start getting into the field, once you start reading all the books, I think most people experience, there's a moment of like, you're kind of persuaded. Oh, there's something here. There's something going on. There's something, this is very compelling. And it's only after many more years when you see, the sort of relentless debunking that can go on, the relentless criticism that goes on, the kinds of shenanigans that you're referring to, right? The patterns of thinking that go into the sort of ETH, extraterrestrial hypothesis, and so on, that you become more skeptical. So, I mean, if push comes to shove, I tend to sort of side with the psychosocial hypothesis, but that's if push comes to shove. Strictly speaking, I'm agnostic. I'm in my more adventurous moments, I'm much more likely to side with Valet, that there's something going on. God knows what it is, but there are some very, very interesting stories out there that are very difficult to explain away. But I don't, for the life of me, know what's going on, and I'm not about to propose an explanation.
And just to be that UFO newbie for a second, having only begun studying in early 2021, it makes me probably the most recent ever. However, I got extremely interested. So, that being said, my history as an atheist. I'm not fundamentally, but I'm conceptually a materialist. In terms of believing the matter or whatever. So I have no religion, all of that stuff. No interest, no fascination historically with the paranormal, supernatural, zero.
Right.
This had nothing to do with my life in any way. So then I got involved in it. And I just want to say, so something that made me question it from an objective, evidentiary perspective. If somebody told me that they saw a 4-foot wide or a 16-foot wide ball of light fly through the sky, I would, question if that was true. I'd probably have said that it wasn't true. But then in 2021, I found a very prominent paper published in 2014 in Physical Review Letters that proves the existence of ball lightning. They verified it spectrographically. So what I saw there was that, and the object was 1.1 meters across, and which is like 3.5 feet or something, or 4 feet, and then a 16-foot recorded glow.
Right.
If those objects do exist, which they do, to what extent are these historic descriptions of objects of that nature being interpreted through these different lenses? It's like barring a world where balls of light like that don't exist, I'd be like, no, there's nothing to it. It's all psychosocial.
Right.
In a world where balls of light like that do exist and fly around, it makes me think people describing these luminous objects throughout history, maybe there's something to it.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
Okay, well, a couple clarifications. First, when I say agnostic, I refer to with regards to the reality and nature of the quote unquote UFO. Okay, I don't know. I've got my interests. Okay, I would say actually that the interpretation of ball lightning and other luminous phenomena as UAP or ghosts or spook lights or whatever is consistent with the psychosocial hypothesis, because is that not the psychosocial hypothesis? That various
Excellent, yes.
phenomena are interpreted the way they are because of certain cultural predilections.
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Okay. That being said, well, what then do you do with cases such as those that came out of France in the 1950s, where people witnessed structured craft? They were metallic, they were circular, they were silent or sometimes accompanied by a whistling sound, and they had a kind of a glass-like cupola on the top. Better yet, once upon a time, there was a French farmer doing some work at night, and his farm was right beside a railroad. He saw a bright light on the railway tracks. He thought, well, someone must be like doing some welding over on the tracks, but why would they be doing it 2 a.m? So he goes over and he sees what looks like a large propane tank with a couple of humanoid figures, kind of in the light, silhouettes. And then they climb inside this thing, and it takes off with a whistling sound. In the morning, he goes to inspect it, and he finds these impressions in the railway ties. He calls the local gendarmerie, who show up, and they bring in some experts, and they calculate that in order for the railway ties to have the impressions that they have, the object must have weighed several tons. Okay? And the more stories like that you read, and there are many of them, the more interesting, shall we say, the phenomenon becomes. So the thing is that what we have on the one hand is, yes, there's a large psychosocial dimension, doubtless, that there's a lot of stories and rumors and hoaxes and lies and misinterpretations and misidentifications and so on and so forth. Absolutely. And this creates a whole kind of mythological field, if you will, a whole kind of mindset, collective mindset. But it's also the case that at the same time, you have very strange, inexplicable stories like this. And you can point to others. I mean, the Valensole case, where the lavender farmer comes across this thing landed in his lavender field. These little guys get out, they paralyze him, and it takes off. Was it a fugue state? Well, maybe. But how many fugue states are there where similar things are recorded? And so on and so forth. What do you do with the Lonnie Zamora case, for example? I mean, there are a lot of explanations. Oh, it was a hoax. Oh, it was a balloon. Oh, it was this and that. But none of these add up either. Right? So there's this residue, this residue of stories which don't quite fit. And you just have to sort of get, well, I throw up my hands. You go, I don't know. That's interesting. I'm going to weave them into my poem. That's what I'm going to do with them. But don't ask me to explain them. But don't ask me to believe that they're visitors from Zeta Reticuli or the Pleiades come to tell us how to live our lives and to save us from ourselves either. Because that's not the case, I don't believe.
This is something that Bernardo Kastrup touches on in Meaning and Absurdity.
Yes, does he?
Yes, that's when I think about sort of the progression or evolution of ideas in this space, I think of that book Meaning and Absurdity by Kastrup, which I've never seen him publicly popularize, but it's very short and totally worth reading. And he talks basically about exploring these experiences, which I think almost fall under like the idea of the uncanny, using alternative paths of logic and reason than the ones we have in modernity. Sort of harkens back to what you were talking about earlier about how history is constructed now and interpreted versus how it was sort of constructed, say, in the medieval period, and understanding the symbolism that can be embedded when reading historical accounts. But yeah, I'm very curious. So we've been talking about ufology broadly as sort of witnessed phenomena. I'm very interested in experiencer phenomena, personally very interested in the subject of spiritual emergence. I've been following Sean S. Bjorn-Hargen's development of the exo-studies curriculum, which sort of takes almost a perennialist approach, I guess, in terms of mapping experiencer phenomena to this sort of history of mystical and numinous experiences across multiple traditions, both Western and Eastern. But I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on experiencers and how this may map to or not map to, in your opinion, the broader kind of mystical experience that's captured in religion throughout history.
Yeah, that's a very, very, again, another rich vein to mine. Being the, I'm going to say, because I'm not a Marxist, I'm not a dogmatic anything, right? I try to sort of like take what I can from whatever discourse I can to make sense of best things, make as much sense as I can of things. But as the Marxist in me says, always historicize. So in that regard, what got me back into UFOs, I mean, because I was interested in them as a boy, but then as St. Paul tells us, you put childish things aside with childhood, was precisely all the stories about alien abduction that were coming up in the 80s and 90s. And what struck me, this is not the whole story, of course, but what struck me was that many, not all, but many of the stories were retrieved under hypnosis, and many of them were from women talking about being subjected to gynecological experiments and other genetical manipulation. And this was all during the time when you had Dolly, the cloned sheep, coming up on the scene. You had advances in fertility treatments, such as IVF, and you had the Human Genome Project. So there was a great anxiety, a great concern, a great interest in things genetic, as well. Women being at a time when IVF was coming up and cloning was coming up, I wonder why women would feel anxious and under hypnosis have a kind of waking dream about being subjected to gynecological experiments by heartless, feelingless scientists.
Wonder where that came
space,
from.
You know, it made too much sense, and I'm hardly the first. So in the historical, so you put the experience right into the historical context, and it makes a lot of sense, right? That's why I'm very not skeptical, but cautious when it comes to any sort of perennialism, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'll read Jung for the fun of it, but I don't buy the archetypes.
Sure.
I'll read Levi-Strauss to get a sense of structuralist methodology, but I don't believe in any sort of universals in that regard. Human beings are first and foremost temporal creatures. We're very local in that regard. However much there is a kind of a material universality, we have to eat, we have to drink, we're gregarious creatures, we're linguistic creatures, but that's very abstract, these universalities, right? There's no content there per se. So in that regard, my first impulse is to always historicize. Okay, let's look at the content of the experience and ask how that resonates with the context of the moment, what's going on in that person's life, what's going on in that person's quote unquote world, context, culture. That being said, right, a lot of religious studies scholars will be, the first to say, yeah, this is a kind of mystical religious experience. But again, the experiencer, there's so many kinds of experience that fall into that category. Terrifying, beatific, and so on. Do we include things like channeling, for example? Would we include the experiences reported by the contactees if we take them at face value? How do we distinguish them from, and this is where things get interesting again, near-death experience, angelic and demonic encounters, hauntings, right? And so on, because these all tend to bear the same character, right? The same structure, for lack of a better word. So again, I'm of two minds. I don't want to shut anything down. My own materialistic, but not in the sense of physical materialism, but cultural materialism. Proclivities say, okay, let's historicize. Let's look at it in the context of the culture, the life of that person, and see if we can't make sense of it there. But it is the case that human beings are given to quote unquote mystical experiences. If you want to make a generalization, I don't know if there's a culture that's not given to that. But you know, a lot of cultures, they seek it out on purpose, and they do it by means of either by invoking all sorts of extreme physical states, either through sleep deprivation, through fasting, through taking entheogens. Right? They seek it out. But what's interesting in our puritanical post-Christian culture is how these experiences are quote unquote spontaneous.
Mm-hmm.
And there you can make a very good argument to say, well, you know, in cultures that seek it out, it has a place and it's understood and it makes sense and it's no biggie. And it's only in cultures that suppress the entheogenic experience that you have this sort of spontaneous eruption of these deeply disturbing experiences that then cry out to be made sense of.
Oh my God, I love this answer so much.
Yeah, that's not me. I think John Mack made this remark. I've heard other people make this observation. And so the thing is, this is why to speak, I don't even like this expression, but indigenous cultures, there's not such a big thing made about, you know, non-human intelligences. The ancestors are with us all the time. There are some cultures that keep the bones of their ancestors in their damn living room. Right. Well, there's Uncle Joe. You know, at Halloween, right? We honor the ancestors. The door between worlds opens up. In lots of cultures, you know, I tell you, among some indigenous peoples, they looked at the Spanish as not being human beings because they didn't have souls because they hadn't gone through these extreme entheogenic experience. To become a full member of the tribe, you had to go through this kind of experience, and only then would you understand what was going on, what was all about. Would you have plugged into reality? But the Spanish hadn't done that. They didn't have souls. Okay, so I think that'd be sort of my. I think perhaps what's going on here is that we're getting something that we need, but again, right? That's very culturally specific, very very historically specific. More than that, I can't say. There are a lot of people who have looked into it a lot more deeply than I have. Among those, some of them that you've mentioned, and I'm sure they would find grounds to disagree with me and grounds to agree with me. But it is the case that among a lot of religious studies scholars, a lot of them will actually, you know, finger this as a kind of mystical experience, and they can. You know, again, to get back to the earliest part of our conversation, and this point is made by Diana Heath. If you actually go back to the diaries of Teresa of Avila, who had a very famous encounter, right, depicted in the very famous sculpture, when you read the diary, which is not couched in the religious narrative conventions of the day, it's very very modern in this regard. It sure sounds a lot like the kind of things that experiencers go through. A diminutive actual physical, she calls it's carne, flesh. It's not an angel. It's not a demon. It's a fleshly thing. This little diminutive dude with this little light and things. And then there are things that are very interesting. You got a really hard, because the thing is, it's not couched in the language of the time.
Right.
Right. Because it's the diary and see, again, but there's the philological labor that's got to be done. You've got to understand the way that people articulated themselves in the discourses available to them at the time, right? And we can't just transpose our ways of speaking and talking onto non-European cultures or cultures in the distant past. Sometimes you can, right? I mean, Augustine St. Augustine was one of the first people to write Confessions,
right.
Much more modern, right? But even then, you know, you've got to look into the narrative conventions. So yes and no. I always prefer a more fine-grained approach. Let's look into here and now, the context, the person, the case study, if you will, and see what we can get from there. But I do, like Leah, like you, like this idea that it's a compensation. We have these deeply disturbing experiences because we don't have a place for it in our culture. Or if you do, Like, for example, among sort of the fundamentalist Christians in our society, it's always interpreted as demonic.
Right.
There is a whole Christian ufology, but the euphonauts are they're demons, and it's a sign of the end times, and so on and so forth.
I think this is a really interesting point, and it speaks to my own experience. As I mentioned, I just didn't have any exposure or involvement with any of these subjects until very recently. But I had experiences historically that now, having interacted with these communities, I realize people interpret in ways that are very different from the way I interpreted them. For example, when I was young, and still do, I have experiences with sleep paralysis, or at least a form of it, where sometimes when I wake up, I will see some, and it's an unusual form, but I'll see something that isn't there for maybe 5 to 10 seconds while having mobility, and then it suddenly disappears. And so when I see Deep Prasad talk about how he believes in UFOs and all this stuff, but he believes in them because he had a nap in his bed and he woke up, and for 5 to 10 seconds he saw an alien and then it disappeared. And like, so to him, that proves that aliens are real. When I was 13 or 14, when I had an experience of seeing like a sphere in my room, and then I looked down and turned on the light to look back, it's completely gone. I go to run to the computer and I type into Google, I saw something when I woke up. And then I just see a ton of peer-reviewed papers about like sleep studies saying that it's a type of sleep paralysis or whatever. And I never thought about it again, ever. And there are people I've met who have their entire lives based around an experience of that nature. So,
yeah. Look, the thing is that, this story, again, this is what interested me about the whole discourse, is that on the one hand, it's marginal. It's precisely not taken seriously. It's the stuff of bad science fiction, of B movies, of kind of crazy people, of nerds and geeks. But at the same time, it's very at the same time, it speaks directly to things that are going on at the heart of society, at the center of society. And that was ultimately the argument about the aliens. I mean, one way of looking at the paper is ask the question, well, why on earth would someone believe something so kooky? Well, I'll tell you why. Because it's perfectly in line with the ideology that governs modern culture. That's why. I mean, can anyone at this point in the age of Elon Musk deny that technology is the reigning ideology of the so-called advanced societies, as Jürgen Habermas pointed out in the 1970s? I don't think so, right? When I'm teaching young people, one thing I'll give them sometimes is a little article about how our history is in danger of disappearing because the media are becoming obsolete. Right. So, we know what a 3.5-inch floppy is. We know what a 5.5-inch floppy is. So the thing is, the media become obsolete and the software to read them become obsolete. And I asked them, why do these things change? Progress, sir. As if it's some sort of natural process. I said, no, investment. That's why it changes. Someone's got money to make. That's why it changes. Right. And this is what I'm on about when it comes to the whole UFO, is that it functions ideologically. The moment we take a cultural formation as an aspect of nature, progress just happens. That is ideology, because it just serves people such as Elon Musk and others who always want to like change things and give us the newest little gadget and so on and so forth. It makes it natural. This is the problem with SETI. There aren't going to be, to imagine, as you said, Nick, like we see ourselves, we're looking for ourselves, but which self are we looking for? We're looking for a particular kind of human being, that which occupies the so-called advanced societies, what used to be called the first world. What about the dudes living up in the Andes who want nothing to do with this nonsense?
That's such a good point.
All right. Who look at us as the little brother who's gone wrong. They call us little brother. Right? What about the Inuit in the north for whom the earth is off its axis? And so on and so forth, right? And this is the whole problem with the ufological discourse, is it takes one instance of human culture, which is very recent and very local, historically and spatiotemporally, as the norm throughout the universe of all intelligent life. And that doesn't tell us anything about anything off the earth, but it tells us everything about our own self-obsessed hubris. And precisely the problem and so there's where the UFO mythology plugs into the climate crisis, the ecological crisis, and everything, because it's precisely this blindness to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
That's the problem. And until we can sort of see ourselves for what we are and see technology for what it is, only then can we begin to sort of like hope to chart a course away from or through it. I think. I would argue.
You raised a few points that kind of illustrate my issues with the Fermi paradox. But kind of calling back to what we were talking about. Yeah, we are looking for we're looking for the white colonizers in space, essentially.
Oh boy, you said it. Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, look. I mean, look at the people who want to. We look at the solar system as ours to colonize.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm sorry. We've had that story. I don't think we're necessarily going to find other people out on the planet, but the whole idea that nature is there for us to exploit as we see fit is coming back and biting. It's not going to bite us in the ass. It's been gnawing us in the ass for decades, right? And for some reason, some people don't feel that. I don't know why, or they're just ignoring it. They're just repressing it. It's not how things work. That's not how things work. The American poet Charles Olson was so happy when we went to the moon and found it was just a horrible, cold, airless, lifeless place, because it made us hopefully appreciate what we've got here more. That was his hope in the 60s. But there's still hope. I will hope until the bitter end.
How would you situate something like the Skinwalker saga and the fact that it's taken up so readily by conservative white men?
Is it? Yeah, it is, eh? It's not just conservative white men. The present owner, as you know, is a Mormon.
Yeah.
This is interesting in itself. And isn't Travis Walker a Mormon?
Possibly.
I may have read that somewhere. I could be wrong. I can always
he's
be
written
wrong.
some science fiction, which I think is in line with science, with Mormonism, if I'm not mistaken.
Something like that. It's very interesting. I mean, I don't know. There is, I mean, you brought up the white colonizer and, the explorer, right? The white man out there exploring new territories. And in a way, isn't that kind of what's going on at the Skinwalker Ranch? But then of course, the moment you mention that, then you've got to bring in the notion, it is the Skinwalker Ranch and there's all this talk about, native curses and stuff. And then you want to start thinking about, well, what's the colonialist dimension of that whole story? I don't know, but it just strikes me. This is something to think about.
I've got an idea.
You've got an idea? What's your idea, Campbell?
Well, I wasn't going to say it, but yeah, no, it's consistent
okay.
with like all of the sports teams being named. You take possession of the items of cultural significance of the culture you dominate. That's been the practice throughout history.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Like, I mean, what is the case is that there's very little doubt that it's a money-making enterprise. It's a kind of ready-made theme park, and it's been commodified into this series, into these books, and so on and so forth. So the thing is that the story of Skinwalker Ranch being kind of what it is culturally is really a question of the capitalist matrix within which it emerges. Why it appeals to its particular audience base? Hey, I watch it. It's worth a chuckle. I do. Oh yeah, it's a total chuckle.
Oh man, never meet your idols. Like,
I said I watch it. I'm not a fan. I watch Forged in Fire too. So I like to see people.
Bryan, you're muted. We lost you.
1 second. There we go.
There you go.
Am I back?
Yes.
I'm back.
Yes.
I'm waving my hands around. I'm adopted. I must have an Italian back in my gene pool. Never meet your idols. Oh, reminds me of a story when Edward Said met Sartre. Very, very sad thing. But hey, I met one of my idols. I met not an idol, but someone I respect. That was Hans-Georg Gadamer. That was a very good meeting. So there you go. Very nice guy. We had wine. Yeah, it was nice. I wrote a poem about it. I'll send you the poem if you want.
I'm not familiar with that individual. Who is that?
Oh, Hans-Georg Gadamer was the kind of the most important student of Martin Heidegger.
Oh,
okay. He left Heidegger's influence because Heidegger was a very strong personality. A very problematic figure, of course, but a very strong personality. And Gadamer knew that he had to clear out in order to find his own space. And so Gadamer is actually a very important philosopher. He born in 1900, died in 2002, would you believe? I met him in 96, 97. But he's important because he founded what's called philosophical hermeneutics. His most important book is called Truth and Method. And it's there that actually you'll find a lot of kind of what I'm talking about in terms of the temporality of understanding and how different times have their own kind of what in phenomenology we call a horizon, kind of a context. And he poses the problem of, well, how is it possible to understand someone coming from a different horizon? And he's got his own way of talking about the fusion of horizons. Because the thing is that when we're talking about something from the past, like for example, if we're trying to read Plato or we're trying to read Isaiah, and this is someone in a very different time, different language, different culture, how is it that we can understand them at all? Well, first of all, we don't go to read them. They've already kind of written us. Mm-hmm. We always already understand them, right? Because they wouldn't be there to be understood if they weren't part of the tradition. Tradition is a very important part of Gadamer's way of looking at things. And then people like Hans Robert Jauss, the literary critic, they take this even further, and you can run with this. But anyway, that's Gadamer's great contribution, and a total sweetheart. And he's written a lot of things. He's written about health, for example. He's written a bit about science and technology. Real great guy. Invited into our wedding.
Nice.
Yeah, he didn't show up.
No.
Man, we got married in 99. He was 99. It was great. Just to say very quickly, in 1996, I took a trip to Germany, and I was in Heidelberg, and so to the amazement of my friends, I phoned Gadamer out of the blue. This no-name Canadian phones this world-famous philosopher, and said, "Hey, I'm so and so. Can I meet in your office?" He said, No. You come to my house. We'll have a little drink. I like a little drink. The guy's 96.
Good for him.
So amazing. So I go out. Of course, I show up an hour early, totally nervous. I go to his big old house, ring on the bell. Phones go down. And there's a shuffling behind the door, and he shows up. He comes to the door himself. He had polio as a young man. So he was still in these braces, and he had crutches, and he came to the door and opened it up for me. We went back to his little back garden. We had nacho chips and white wine and a wonderful conversation, and left it from there. So it was a great moment. Yeah. So you meet your idols. meet. Don't be afraid to phone them up and say, "Hi, can we have a talk?" Sure. You're not stalking me.
we're coming up right on the bottom of the hour.
Yes.
This has been wonderful.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
I was going to ask, would you mind extending just a bit longer? Because
not at all.
I know we do have some more questions. And
sure, if the people who've tuned in aren't totally fed up with me by now, you got to take me. Microdose me. Microdose me. Yeah. That's the only way I can handle myself. Oh my goodness. Anyway, please, what more can we talk about here?
Well, something that you were just saying about that philosopher, I thought was interesting. You mentioned that philosopher was concerned with different sort of worldviews colliding. Is that correct? And
yeah, kind of.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and something we've really dealt with a lot on this show under Leah's guidance, largely in a very good way, is this breakdown of consensus reality that we're sort of seeing in modern culture. And I'm wondering what that philosopher would have to say about it.
Oh boy. Actually there's a fellow whose name eludes me right now. What I do is I stalk the different university presses. I watch them all like a hawk. And when they've got sales, I swoop down and make an investment, as you can see behind me. And actually a fellow wrote a book, can't remember the title, can't remember the author, all about how hermeneutics, right, the art of understanding, the art of interpretation, okay, can be used precisely in this field when it comes to irresolvable problems over race, over gender, which are the big topics in south of the border anyway. Up here too, but more vehemently in the south of the border, it seems to me anyway. Because what hermeneutics points out is precisely that where you seem to have an irresolvable conflict, you must have some sort of shared assumption, some sort of shared. In other words, you can't have two teams fighting it out unless they're on the same field. So the whole point here is, okay, well, what do they have in common that they're fighting over? What's the hill? So that's one way it can help. The other way is it can sort of begin to help to try to find a common language, to find out where people are misinterpreting each other, right? So for example, if you look at the expression woke, the first time I heard it a few years ago, it was used, I heard it in a pejorative sense, right? Then I heard people use it in a kind of a good, that's a good thing to be woke. And now in Canada, it seems to kind of shifted back to almost only pejorative. But what do we mean by that? What do we mean by gender? What do we mean by sex? What do we mean when we say defund the police? What do we mean by that? Why would we say that? So you got to find it. First of all, what's the common grounds? We've got to find a common language. And then over and above that, we have to sort of find out what's at stake. What do people want out of this whole thing? And then we get into a whole different field, which you find in legal scholarship, which is alternative dispute resolution, which tries to move parties beyond a zero-sum game to try to find the most mutually beneficial resolution to their apparently irresolvable conflict. So hermeneutics is very, very important in this regard. I think it offers a lot of possibilities, and there's at least one scholar out there who's digging into it. But you've got to, you see, the other thing is that from a more Marxist perspective, what we see are actually, real social conflict. What happens at the symbolic level happens because something at the material level is not resolved. So, for example, when it comes to so-called cancel culture, why is it so vehement? Well, because the claims of marginalized peoples have not been resolved at the material level, right? At the level of equality, at the level where they're not fearing for their lives, at the level where they're not subject to more greater instances of self-harm, suicide, depression, so on and so forth, right? The moment that they have that sort of material security, the moment they're kind of folded into the workings of society, then these more symbolic struggles disappear. But the symbolic struggles become important precisely because the real problems are not resolved. So you have to bump it up to fighting over pronouns, right? Because they don't get the necessary respect just in everyday life. If you resolve that, then a lot of other problems go away. So as a Marxist, and then Slavoj Žižek has made this point, that a lot of so-called political correctness is just bumping up social struggle into the symbolic level, language representation and so on, because things are not resolved materially in the institutions of society.
That is so fascinating because just on UFO Twitter, I'll just make a single short comment. Just on UFO Twitter, there is a constant, significant, ongoing battle about what it even means to say UFO.
Sure.
Are UFOs real, in quotes? I've gotten into a lot of arguments with skeptics and truth seekers about if ball lightning with the same features that are described by UFO advocates actually exist. Does that mean UFOs exist? Well, the UK Ministry of Defense says yes. The CIA, US Air Force says yes. A vast majority of skeptics say no. So I don't know what to make of that. But what you were just saying feels very close to an answer to why I've been struggling with this.
Yeah, well, what you want to say is, listen, we all know what UFO means, but what we're doing is we know what it means, but we're struggling. We're in dispute over what it denotes, right? The German philosopher Frege made this distinction back like over 100 years ago between sense and reference. And the illustration, the classical illustration is that the morning star is the evening star. They're both Venus, right? Morning star and evening star, different expressions for the same thing. The sense is different, but the reference is the same. With UFO, we know what the sense is, but we don't know what the reference is. We're over in dispute of what the reference is. Oh, it refers to scout ships from Zeta Reticuli. No, it refers to misidentifications of natural phenomena. No, it refers to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what so there's the agreement, because you couldn't be fighting about it unless you didn't already share some understanding of the expression, right? And in a way, this is where just like an understanding of linguistics can come into play, because there are a lot of people, a lot of kind of older timers, resisting the shift from UFO to UAP. But you know what? It doesn't make a difference, because what's happened is the expression UFO and UAP tend to be used in the same way, right? It's not that unidentified aerial phenomena is trying to cover up the fact that it's not an object. Well, no, it's just that what happens is they function in the same, they've got the same function in the language. So for example, I can play chess and I can use ivory pieces, I can use wooden pieces, I can use stone pieces, I can use little pebbles. But as long as it functions like a pawn, it's a pawn. And the point is that flying saucer, UFO, UAP at a certain level are all the same piece, right? Just different materials. And that's called, in structural linguistics, that's called a transformation, where you put in a new piece. So.
You mentioned working on Wittgenstein previously, and I feel like I heard a little bit of Wittgenstein in there, letting the fly out of the bottle or whatever.
Well, no, that's a lot more semiotics and structuralism there.
Well, okay. Well, I've got to refresh myself on it.
I wish, let that fly out of the bottle. Absolutely. There's a lot of that to be done in the UFO field for sure. But see again, but then that I look at it from the point of view of quote unquote the concept, right, rather than the thing, right? And so when it comes to say the science of ufology, what's interesting for me is the way that it brings to bear notions of what is or is not legitimate science, what gets funded, what does not get funded, who pays attention to what, right? This is all got to do with like the sociology of science, the history and philosophy of science, more than the actual practice of discovering how much a muon weighs, right? And of course it's safer there for me because, like I say, if to take seriously the question of the nature, the being of the UAP, for lack of a better word, boy, that's a whole other rabbit hole, and I would need a whole other life to do that. Although I've got Sturrock's book on the wall and Rudge's book on the wall and so on, but that's just I try to avoid that, and I will avoid that just to maintain a certain intellectual honesty. So I don't know. It's all very interesting. Talk to someone who understands that stuff. Physics. Talk to someone who can make the calculations. Let them do it. I can talk to you about the mythological aspect, the ideological aspect. And that's what does it for me, because I think there's a lot more at stake there. Although if it turns out to be some really earth-shattering, paradigm-shattering natural phenomenon, that would be interesting too. But like I say, I still don't think it's cryptoterrestrials or interdimensionals or zeta reticulans. I think isn't that the kind of the least interesting possible explanation? Isn't that kind of impoverished? Yes. Doesn't that lack imagination? Doesn't that oh, come on.
Yeah.
I mean, can you come up with something more interesting than that? Because as Nick says, well, that's just ourselves again. There's enough of it. Yeah. There's 8 billion of us now. Let's get some. I want something different.
Flying vehicles. Yeah. It's a very human idea.
Yeah. It's just Tesla. More Tesla. Self-driving UAPs. No, give me something different. Give me something interesting. And a lot of people who are interested in the question of the nature of are also, crying out loud, give me something new. It's like ETH, not ETH. Well, give me something new.
I've been trying.
Yeah, well, get to work, young man. But it's good. The theme has vista. And this is what I'm always trying to defend. This is Walt Whitman. The theme has vista. Right? There's all sorts of crazy shit you can talk about, and everything flows into it. Isn't that interesting? Right? And you know this as well as I do. Right? The UFO, and that's the other great thing, right? Because the UFO creates a vortex. Right? In the traditional view, right? There's always that whirlwind that sucks up the person of the UFO where they get abducted. Well, the UFO is a cultural phenomenon, has this vortex into which everything gets sucked. Economics, politics, sexuality, science, consciousness.
It touches every single discipline.
And I just
Is
want to
that-
say
Isn't that
vortex.
wild?
Vortex
It's a
is the
vortex.
perfect word because the
It's a
most
beautiful
modern interpretation of ball lightning is a electromagnetic vortex. So
There you go.
quite
See?
literally.
See? Electromagnetism. Yeah, well, you try. That's all you can do. You can only ever try. Yeah. So it's all, yeah. This is why I like the whole deal. But this is the thing. It's so big though, right? It's like, how do you eat? There's like the question, how do you eat an elephant? Right? With a bun and some mustard? No, a little bit at a time. Well, I don't know. How do you eat a nebula? Because it's something that's like so much bigger, so much vaster. And so the thing is, I've been working on this damn poem, this damn epic piece since 1993, right? And I got like bits and pieces and stuff. But the thing is, like, it just got to read this book. Oh, there's got to read that book. Got to take some more notes. And the thing is, it's gotten to the point where the project is now the website in a way.
Mhm.
I've ended up writing the interpretation of a poem that I haven't written. Right? So the myth is the poem that's already there, and the epic poem is in fact this website which interprets the myth as a poem, and then sometimes interjects little poems of its own. So if I die before I finish the damn thing, that's the job. That's the work. Like,
Ouroboros.
oh yes,
The snake eats its own tail.
the snake eats its own tail. Indeed. Yep. Oh boy. Oh, what fun.
Is the UFO a circle because it is a vortex, do you think? Is it like an expression of that subconsciously?
Who are you asking me?
That's a good question. I mean, on the one hand, the answer to scream out is yes. But the thing is that the UFO is not a circle, right? What's truer to say is the UFO is polymorphous, right? Even the so-called first flying saucers weren't flying saucers, right? They were crescents. And the UFO notoriously takes many shapes. So, I mean, we're all familiar with, I'm sure, the sort of charts that were made by the early UFO study groups of all the pictures of flying saucers to try to catalog their shapes. And they're all kind of the same, but they're all kind of different. And now, as we all know, they're even more amorphous because they seem to change shape in midair, and they become a structure, and then they become a blob, and then they wink out, and then they. So this is the other beautiful thing about the UFO or the UAP or whatever we want to call it, is that, notice again, first of all, the expressions we use to denote it are always changing, and the phenomenon itself is always changing, right? This is what the philosopher Derrida might refer to as difference. That there's this constant changing, it's always one step ahead of us, one step beyond us. And the moment we think we got to pin down, nope, it's something else. That's very interesting. And that is a feature of the so-called paranormal in general. You find it in cryptozoology, you find it in parapsychology, you find it in the study of ghosts and things. It's always this, you think you got it, but it's something else. This is what Hansen calls the trickster, right? Mm-hmm. Which is itself very, very interesting. And that has a profound ontological significance, because isn't reality like that, right? I mean, we break it down, then we hit the quantum field, and all bets are off, because all the conceptual tools we have just don't work. I was discussing this with a student today. It may be the case that the quantum realm is something where the human mind, which evolved in kind of a more Newtonian realm, just can't hack it. It just doesn't have the wherewithal. It doesn't have what it takes to make sense of it in the same way that our normal consensus perceptual world makes sense to us. And the UFO perhaps points to that, right? These phenomena, they point to that there's something more, there's something beyond. And that is an important point, absolutely, because we human beings like to think we've got it figured out and we're in charge. But as Mama Aya told Terence McKenna, you monkeys think you're in charge. No, that's not how it is. So it breaks a certain hubris. It's a point where science runs up against something it cannot resolve. That's important. That's interesting in itself. And then this plays itself out socially in a lot of other ways too. Mm-hmm. So again, like the theme has vista. Holy smokes. You're gonna be talking about this forever. As long as there's a YouTube, you'll be having live streams. I hope.
Well, you mentioned the phenomena changing, and this is something we've talked about a bit too. But I've kind of noticed that it tends to always move into these darker categories of our understanding. Like now, people often will appeal to quantum mechanics or what they say is consciousness, which actually happens to be another ambiguous word that I don't think people are on the same field with. And it was kind of the same with ghost hunting. We were talking about ghost hunting a few weeks back, where so like in the beginning, in like the contactees and stuff, these aliens were coming from our solar system, and they've kind of moved out as our understanding has expanded. So I wonder if that's just kind of the easy way out, is that the explanations are moving along with our understanding into those darker corners.
That the only way to explain the inexplicable is to appeal to the inexplicable. Right? That we explain the mysterious in equally mysterious terms.
Sure. I suppose that makes sense.
I mean, that itself is just psychologically interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Culturally interesting. Because this is the other thing, is that the moment that modernity shows up and the supernatural dissolves, right, and everything collapses into this purely immanent order, right? And of course, that's the name of that first paper I wrote with Dr. Palmer, presumed immanent. Okay. Suddenly, there's a loss of mystery. Right. Remember that for various reasons, mind you, in the Enlightenment, the thing was to explain away miracles, ghosts, all the so-called superstitions, right? And to reduce it to science, or to find a scientific explanation for it. And I think there's a good reason that we resist that. There's a very good reason we resist that, because there's a kind of hubris to reason. There's a kind of hubris to the science, the material sciences, that think that they can reduce everything to matter, to a physicalist explanation, and that we can finally get a handle on everything. Now, I think a lot of scientists are kind of the last people to admit that. That's kind of the function that science plays in our culture in general, I think, that it's going to explain things. And then, of course, what's interesting with that is the way that people resist that, for example, with vaccine hesitancy. And I speak as someone with a dampened immune system who's had 5 vaccinations against COVID. Okay. So again, it's again, the same sort of mechanism. So you can sort of move out into other fields, another phenomena, other social phenomena, and say, isn't that kind of the same thing? The way that reason and unreason, work together, play with each other, gain and lose ground relative to each other. But that's that's something else again. Ay. Yeah. Holy smokes. Ugh. What has someone asked something on the side?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Where did you find this guy?
Questions. One of the questions we got, I may not be able to find it, but it was asking about how the New School may have influenced your approach to this subject.
The New School?
Yes. The explicit question is Bryan influenced by the New School, and how has that informed or influenced his psychosocial approach to ufology?
I'm not too sure what is being referred to by the New School there. There's a place in New York called the New School.
The Marxist New School. Frankfurt School.
Oh, Frankfurt School. Oh, well, do I really need to pull down all the Adorno from my bookshelf? Oh yeah, look, excellent. Sure. No, yes. Okay. I'm very influenced by that. Absolutely. I've already cited Habermas, right? Whose book in the 1970s talks about ideology, or the technology as ideology in the so-called advanced societies. My approach to culture as ideology critique finds its example and model in Adorno. Absolutely. Although Adorno is like way above me. I'm, really terrifying mind. Absolutely. Yeah. Very much influenced by that in my own way. Right? So, I make of it what I can as best I can and run with it. I'm not satisfied with it because the notion of ideology is a very slippery concept to bring to bear. I've got a kind of rough and ready version of it. But I mean, I'm waiting for the day that Zizek says something about UFOs. I'm sure he'd have something almost interesting to say. But I think I may have beaten him to it. So on and so forth.
I kind of can't believe he hasn't commented on UFOs. It
That's
seems
what I
like
was
a
just
very
thinking.
Zizek sort of thing to talk about.
Well, it's kind of out of his wheelhouse in a way. In as much as, like, I think in Eastern Europe, it's not really the thing, and I think his generation is not really the thing. It's
guess
popular
that's fair.
culture, but his popular culture's got more to do with
It's American
cinema.
popular culture too.
Very well, is it? I mean, if they're going to talk
in
about a
its current
universal
form,
phenomenon,
it seems that way.
I'm sorry.
Right, but in its presence in modernity, it seems that way. It's certainly where the overwhelming majority of sightings are reported. It seems to be where there's a continuous stream of discourse in these government and military adjacent spaces. There also seems to be a much stronger and more well-developed just general conspiracy culture in America.
I think that latter point, I would tend to agree with. I think there's been a lot of interest in UFOs in Europe, for example, for the longest
Brazil.
time.
Yeah,
And then so Latin America, yes,
yeah.
Australia, New Zealand. I'm sure there's a lot going on in Africa. There are religious movements in China, in Southeast Asia, in Japan. I think you can make a pretty strong case that there's a quote unquote global phenomenon in that regard. And that itself is interesting. But I think that speaks as much. Yeah, go on.
I was just going to say, because of we're talking about Eastern Europe and stuff. This is something I've sort of come across a fair bit in my studies of the subject. I've leaned in heavily to the Harley Rutledge's, Massimo Teodorani's, Erling Strand's kind of stuff, trying to observe it empirically. In the Eastern Europe and Russia, right? They were, as you obviously know, but just for everybody, the Soviets, they were atheists, materialists, very hardcore physics, focus. And my understanding is that UFO phenomena in the Soviet Union were interpreted as ball lightning phenomena. I've seen many papers about the electrostatics, interpreting the phenomena, talking about them orbiting aircraft, following aircraft through electrostatic mechanisms. So, and there are databases at universities in Russia with tens of thousands of ball lightning witness reports. But the qualitative descriptions are essentially exactly what we would see in the MUFON database. So do you think that maybe is that a philosophical interpretive thing? Because you mentioned the Mormonism and how, we were saying like the philosophy of Mormonism includes like other planets. So maybe, do you think that the Soviet philosophy based in materialist Marxism maybe influenced that interpretive decision as well?
Oh boy, the history of science in the Soviet Union is I've got a big book on the bookshelf here all about that. It's wild. It's
Soviet
wild
science. Yeah.
Holy smokes. On the one hand, I'm sure, look, there's doubtless like really serious hardcore physicalist scientists in what was the Soviet Union and Russia that studied the problem. Yes. On the other hand, okay, as Dugin is the first to point out, Russia never went through modernity. There's a strong religious, spiritual, mystical dimension to Russian culture. Even among the Russian scientific community, there was, of course, famously cosmism. Among the Trotskyists, you have Posadism, which didn't understand UFOs in a spiritual sense. They understood them as machines. But there is this aspect to it, and there's a great deal of kind of spiritualism, religiosity in Russian culture, and I'd be very interested to sort of see what kind of inroads various New Age movements with the flying saucer that orbit the flying saucer or are orbited by the flying saucer have made into Russian and like what was that Eurasian culture in general. That would be very interesting, and I bet there's more to find out there than we might think. I bet. I could be wrong. Yeah, but I think what's important here is that each continent, if you will, gives an inflection to the phenomenon. So we, very famously in Latin America, there are more hairy dwarves, right? Then there are little gray men, right? The grays are more prevalent in actually parts of Europe and in the United States. In Africa, I don't know what they encounter. In Japan, there's a wonderful story about this kind of like giant starfish. That's really cool. And so again, the question is, what's wonderful again is how culturally relative, right? The appearance is, and what that might speak to about the phenomenon. And many people have run with this idea, arguing against it being something like real, like people visiting from Mars or Zeta Reticuli or the Pleiades or so on. Rather, it must be something more localized or something much more given to metamorphosis relative to the observer, right? That itself is interesting, but of course that lends itself to a psychosocial explanation. Right? Well, why do people in South America see this? Well, because they're in South America, et cetera, et cetera. So, but it's interesting that there are all these databases. I mean, Vallée has written a book about his, I think it was called. About visiting the Soviet Union. There's also the very famous Voronezh landing incident where there were again giants. This is it. In other parts of the world, they're not small; they're really tall. This is very, very famous moment, and this has been investigated. This has been investigated by Soviet scientists. So what's going on there? I don't know. Very interesting.
That's about the only Soviet case I'm semi-familiar with. As with the, they were automatons.
Very famous.
Robots?
Yeah, well, there were these big, tall, giant dudes without a head, and they had these little robots, apparently. But it's all. But then apparently the investigators used dowsing to find the ley lines or something like this.
Wow.
It was really, really interesting. Really interesting. But you got to use what you can use. So.
Nick, did you have a final question for Bryan?
If I did, I've forgotten it.
Okay.
Fair enough. So we're approaching the top of the hour here.
Okay.
Bryan, thank you so much for the time tonight. This was amazing.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
But before we close things out, where can we find you?
Skunkworksblog.com.
Wonderful.
That's the ufological site. And then if you're interested in the more literary work, it's bryansentis.com or Poeta Doctus. PoetaDoctus. And these are the two main places where I put up what I put up when I put it up. So
Fantastic.
there we go. Thank you for the time. Thank you for the information. It's been a lot of fun. I hope good. Yes. Thank you.
This was a pleasure.
I look forward to continuing the conversation at a future time when they land on the White House lawn.
Yes. Fingers crossed.
Silas been proven right. Oh no.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bryan. It's been wonderful. This is
thank you very much,
kind of conversation.
Thanks, Bryan.
Yes. All right.
Good. This will carry on. The theme has Vista.
Yes.
Good.
Excellent.
Have a nice night. All right, gentlemen, thank you so much again for joining the Invisible Night School. Does anyone have any parting thoughts before I close out the stream?
Great combo. That's the exact kind of conversation I am looking to have.
Yeah, definitely.
Really
this is probably one of my favorite episodes that we've done.
Yeah, 100%. This was awesome. Louis, thank you so much for making the introduction. All right, so gentlemen, next week we will be joined by Erica Lukes on, I think it's, she'll be joining us. We'll be resuming, I think, our 9 p.m. Eastern time slot. If anything changes, of course, I'll put that out on Twitter. In the meantime, folks tuning in, whether live or on recording, please feel free to like, share, subscribe, join us on Discord, find us on Twitter. We'd love to hear from you guys. And stay safe, stay smart, stay sharp. See you guys next week.
See ya.
Bye, everyone.